Jesus said, "What comparison can I make with this generation? They are like children shouting to others as they sit in the marketplace. You, we piped in a tune and you wouldn't dance. We sang you a dirge and you wouldn't mourn. Yet John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he is possessed. The chosen one comes eating and drinking, and they say, this one is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Wisdom will be vindicated by their own actions." Then Jesus prayed, "Abba God, creator of heaven and earth, to you I offer praise for what you have hidden from the learned and the clever you have revealed to the youngest children. Yet, yes, Abba, everything is as you want it to be. Everything has been handed over to me by Abba God. No one knows the only begotten except Abba God, and no one knows Abba God except the only begotten, and those to whom the only begotten wants to give that revelation. Come to me, all you who labor and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon your shoulders and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble of heart. Here you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is kind and my burden is life-giving."
Some years ago, I found myself in a community college classroom with the hopes of learning the French language. That's right, I had it in my mind that I was going to visit France one day. And I thought that it might be useful to learn a little bit about the language and the culture in order to better appreciate what I discovered there. Now, it wasn't my first attempt at that. See, I had previously endeavored to learn French using Rosetta Stone, if you can remember that picture-based software. And that went okay, but after some time, I realized it was going to take a more intensive effort than just self-study. I was going to need some group practice. So years later, I enrolled in French 101, and that went much better. I found that it gave me a much better sense of foundational underpinning to build on. Now, the room we held class in was laid out in a semicircular pattern with the instructor seated in the middle, and I sat at the end of the front row on the far side, so right about where Kathy is right now, and being located near the white cinder block wall, sometimes I would hear the rather lively and engaged class next door learning German. It was the language hall, you see. And one day I became fascinated by a poster hanging next to me on the wall. It wasn't a framing of the Ten Commandments. This was before that time. Rather, it was a copy of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. If you're not familiar with that document, that is the French version of the Declaration of Independence, written in 1789, just 4 years after the American one. I suppose one might say that another group of motivated people became inspired by our efforts. Perhaps. Now, this one is like our version. It proclaims the natural and inalienable rights of people. But where our document declares the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the French one took it a step further to say that people have the right to life, to property, to security, and resistance to oppression. And so it was that resistance to oppression that drew me in. Now, This was a time period of what historians and philosophers call the Enlightenment, a generation of folks living in a world of hierarchies where the strong dominated the weak. And they were thinking seriously about the ideals of liberty and freedom, and in that saw the limits of a government that failed to represent and serve the people, as well as religious institutions that had at times abandoned the people. And so it was a new thing when this generation of dreamers resolved to remove itself from the yoke of what they called tyranny. In America, it meant to officially break from an authoritarian British rule and be ruled instead by the power of the people. Technically, it's called "We the People," as the Constitution would later declare that. And so, in that sense, the founding document declares independence not only from a particular tyrant, in this case, King George III, but from any and all aspiring tyrants who might come after him. And that is what July 4th marks, something new and radical, that folks could indeed govern themselves. Now, as Americans, we know that July the 4th is a day of massive proportions. And the day usually begins with some sort of a flag raising. There's usually a parade worth attending. And we'll also spend some time gathering with our families or friends or neighbors with the hopes of eating food that is grilled to perfection. And after the parades and gatherings, the day typically ends with a fireworks show, one as large as the city budget can allow for, and one that is almost always accompanied by an inspirational musical piece of some sort. And so every year we get the noise and lights of would-be cannons and try to imagine ourselves as not just reliving the battle for independence that began some 250 years ago, but actually continuing on that dream. And by the end of the night, we retire to our beds, wearily content that this grand experiment has survived as long as it has. Truly, it is a holiday like no other. There is more, though, to the 4th than just food and sights and noise. It is, after all, a celebration of our freedom and our citizenship, the right to belong and participate in this grand experiment. So the holiday should remind us that there is work still yet to be done, that the labor for freedom and democracy continues, because democracy is by definition a work of the people. It's not an effortless endeavor, but one that requires constant engagement. But not everyone celebrates it equally, though. Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall once argued that from the start, the Constitution was a flawed document because it accepted the universal and unacceptable reality of slavery. And as such, it only postponed what would take much blood and many years to resolve. But know that he wasn't blaming the writers of the Constitution for that. It was indeed the spirit of the times. And they did leave us with a way to correct our wrongs and modify our circumstances as time went on. And one thing he believed is that it was not just the writers that should be celebrated, because he also said that it was the increasing consciousness of the people that led to the virtues contained in the Constitution. In other words, the credit for the ingenuity of the Constitution should go to the people rather than the individual framers. And understanding that, he said it is not so much time past that needs to be celebrated in this grand experiment of democracy, but time passing and present. In other words, thinking of the Constitution as a means rather than an end, as a vehicle. It is not so much what the framers intended, but what they would allow. Therefore, credit should go to those who used that freedom or that pursuit of freedom wisely and well. Freedom is what it always has been, not something lived in completeness, but a constant renewal and reforming of freedom carried out by a number of people over a number of years and under a number of circumstances that is to be both contemplated and celebrated with the end goal of freedom in mind. Because there was a time when folks in the black community had no legal rights to speak of, and with that, no vote. There was a time when women too had no legal rights as well, and with that, no vote. Freedom then reminds us that it is a slowly evolving process, not always discernible, but ever to be pursued and ever to be cherished when found. Scholars say that the people of Matthew's community found themselves worn thin by economic uncertainty and political cruelty. The region just north of Jerusalem was by no means a peaceful countryside unaffected by politics. It instead was an agricultural region that was being squeezed by several layers of taxation all at once. Not only were the people of Galilee forced to pay outrageous taxes to fund the local governor's palaces and personal projects, they were also being weighed down by priestly tithes and temple dues. Some scholars even estimate that working class families of Galilee at the time may have owed anywhere between 1/3 to 1/2 of their annual harvest yields due to all of these overlapping demands. So when Jesus speaks to the weary and heavy laden, he's speaking to people being ground down by the political and economic systems of their day. With that, he invites them to take up his yoke in place of Caesar's yoke. Now, we do not see many yokes around these days. Indeed, it's easy to forget that a yoke, or a wooden bar or frame that joins two animals together so that as a team they can pull a heavy load. The yoke is not only something meant for two, but something that was used in order to train inexperienced animals for their work. You see, farmers would team strong animals like oxen or cattle that were less experienced with ones that had more experience. They did this so that the novice could learn how to pull the weight of the load, thereby making the burden of the load a bit easier and lighter to bear. Jesus, though, seems to be saying here that it's not so much that the yoke is easy. He knew that we all have a burden to bear, but rather, as the Greek word indicates, that his yoke is one that is supportive and generous and kind. Because when you get up close and personal with the harness on a cow, you find that it has the potential to chafe the shoulders, causing quite a bit of discomfort. But if one were to go the extra effort to get the right kind of harness, one that is kinder and gentler instead of dominating and oppressive, one that gives more than it takes, one placed just the right way on the shoulders, you see, that would be a burden a cow could much more easily bear. Then the younger cow doesn't have to struggle so much to pull the load. Beloveds, the yoke that Jesus offers is one that is shaped by kindness, by humility, designed to fit the one who bears it. One that is without the wounds or exploitative weight of the burdens imposed by authoritarian and abusive religion. The yoke that Jesus offers is one of community and fellowship, one with faith at the center. God loves us that much. For Jesus, the question isn't whether we'll carry a yoke, but whose yoke it will be. And that matters in a world where human value is measured in terms of output and productivity. It matters in a world where consumerism steers folks toward individual buying power rather than collective flourishing. It matters in a world where the political order of the day turns exhaustion and distraction into a tool of control. And it matters in a world where refugees who are tired and poor and hungry become turned away at the border. In closing, I'll say that freedom is what enables us to pursue God's desires for us. It's that thing that beckons from inside of us that justice could be achieved for all, because God's love is for all, and abundance is for all. We live into that dream when we pursue fellowship, when we pursue respect for ourselves, when we have love and regard for neighbor. Altogether, those things make for a community of God, a neighborhood where love is at the center. And that would be a dream worth pursuing. Amen.